Welcome to Marin Voices and Views. With Peter B. Collins, I'm Lawrence Allen Strick. In our second segment, Nancy Mullane, a radio reporter, will be joining us. She has just written a book about prisoners who have been paroled from San Quentin. They'd previously been serving life sentences.
Over the past year here on Marin Voices and Views, we have talked with most of the 12 candidates who ran for Lynn Woolsey's congressional seat in the primary. Now, if you're one of our treasured regular viewers, you may have noticed that Larry did many of those interviews without me. That's because starting in January, I went to work as a media advisor for one of those candidates, Marin Supervisor Susan Adams. I had worked on 2 of Susan's campaigns for supervisor and was very pleased when she asked me to work on her congressional campaign. Supervisor Adams returns to our program today to talk about her campaign for Congress. Susan, welcome back.
It's great being here.
Now, just a quick recap for our viewers. This was a race for a rare open seat in the House of Representatives, triggered by the retirement of Democrat Lynn Woolsey after 20 years. The sprawling new 2nd District, which was drawn by the new Citizens Redistricting Commission, runs from the Golden Gate Bridge all the way to the Oregon border, more than 500 miles from end to end. In the June primary election, Assemblyman Jared Huffman placed first, and Republican Dan Roberts edged out Democrat Norman Solomon by only 173 votes for second place. Newcomer Stacey Lawson, who spent the most money in the primary, placed fourth, just about 1% ahead of Susan Adams. Now, Susan, you spent 11 months on this campaign. You put thousands of miles on your little hybrid car. You participated in countless debates and public meetings. You spent hundreds of hours dialing for dollars. Tell our viewers what you learned from this process.
Well, I have absolutely no regrets for having taken on this adventure. I've met some incredible people up and down the coast that are doing some really amazing work. I think our media doesn't give enough attention to the positives that are happening in our community, whether it's watershed restoration or healthcare issues. And the thing that I'm probably most proud of is that I got way more votes per dollar spent than the other candidates. But there was a lot of cross-pollination that occurred, and a number of the policy issues that I'm going to be working on now in Marin County are issues that I've had opportunities to learn about from my colleagues and friends up in the north. And I'm going to be bringing some information to them about Marin Clean Energy. So it certainly wasn't a wasted effort. It was an amazing journey, and I don't have any regrets.
Mm-hmm.
This was the first time the congressional voting was for the top 2. And Jared Huffman essentially entered the race really early. He had his eyes on the seat before the retirement was announced, and had a huge advantage with name recognition in a lot of parts of the district and getting money. Were you angling in some ways for a second place finish to have a male-female race go forward, or did that enter your thoughts as you were moving forward in the campaign?
Well, I think it was important to have a woman's voice in the debates, and of the 12 candidates, there were 3 women in the race, which was actually a good thing to have, women in the race. The challenge, though, for women who are running is that I don't think we have yet achieved the woman's vote. I think that women still may not understand the importance of the need to support a strong woman candidate and to have gender balance in Washington. I think that when we only have 16% of our elected representatives being women, I think women bring a different kind of dialogue, a different way of problem solving. They bring different issues to the forefront. And we have a little ways to go yet. But I was very proud to be representing a number of issues that are important to women and families: healthcare, childcare, education. One of the things that I've learned, though, is that in the future, if I were ever to take on something like this, you start a lot earlier. And Norman started relatively early, too. He was pretty much right on the heels of Assemblymember Huffman. And so I was waiting to see if Lynn Woolsey was going to still stay, because I was, hoping that she would use her long-term tenure to continue to grapple with the really difficult issues that we're dealing with. It's going to be difficult for a freshman congressman at this particular time in Washington, I think. But certainly Jared brings a number of skills with him that I think will serve the community well. And in a Democratic district, it's pretty likely that he's going to be the next representative.
Now, this 17% of females in the House of Representatives, and with Lynn Woolsey retiring and 2 males running for her seat now in the runoff in November, it is in effect a net loss. What do you think is needed to make the case to voters, including males, that women in leadership provide an important perspective and an important balance to the testosterone that dominates?
Well, that's a really interesting conversation. I attended a House event that Stacey Lawson and some of her supporters put together to actually have a conversation about that issue. And we have to find out why women are maybe afraid of running for office in the first place. I mean, you read the newspapers. For 10 years that I've been in local government, you get a lot of people throwing the slings and arrows at you because they think you're not representing what their particular interest is, not understanding that we have a whole constituency to pay attention to. And one of the things that I said is that, I don't know if you remember the Tom Hanks statement that he made when he was coaching the women's baseball team in that film that, I'm blanking on the name of the film now, but he said, "There's no crying in baseball." Well, there's no crying in politics either. And politics, some people have described it as a blood sport. And all of us were fighting to be in the position of one of the top 2 going to November. And at the end of the day, you can't hold grudges. You have to reach out to the people that you ran against. Everybody had something unique and interesting to say in the conversation, and that's what's exciting about our democratic process, the fact that there were 12 people willing to take the slings and arrows and get in front of about 50 forums and debates to answer some really tough questions.
Stacey Lawson finished 4th, and Roberts, with his money, finished 2nd. You had your budget about $200,000. How much of a role do you think money plays in a congressional race, and how important it is for you as a candidate to make sure you're getting that money in on a regular basis?
Yeah, unfortunately, money is an important factor. Grassroots is important, but unless you have the war chest right now, the way our political system is set up, Stacey had a number of commercials and advertisements on television. People were seeing her regularly. And in a district this huge, if I'm knocking on doors and sending out a couple of mailers, that doesn't have the same kind of penetration. I think part of the issue is, how do we help engage our young people to understand the importance of engaging in the democratic process, learning how to find out the information about candidates, and really picking a candidate that will best represent your voice rather than paying attention to the sound bites that people pay for. Certainly, it demonstrated the need for campaign finance reform, for addressing the Citizens United issue. But the fact is that it only bought about 10% of the votes on a relatively unknown candidate in the district. And my campaign bought about the same amount because of being involved and engaged in the community for as long as I have. So you put the two together and you have a pretty strong campaign. So there's certainly work to do, and there's a lot of lessons learned. But money in politics, the timing, launching a campaign a lot earlier, as Jared did, those are all factors that help to make a successful campaign. I'll have a lot of fun stories for my best-selling book someday.
Now, Susan, I produced your television commercials, and most of what we ran were positive statements about your vision if you were elected to Congress. But we also ran a spot that was critical of your opponent, Stacey Lawson. We compared her to Meg Whitman because they both had bad voting records. And Ms. Lawson was making claims that were really hard to prove about how her experience in business would produce jobs if she were elected to Congress. And we had a healthy debate inside the campaign, and you were a little uncomfortable about an edgy commercial like the Meg Whitman spot. Tell our viewers how you feel about those kinds of campaign messages.
Well, it's always difficult because you walk the fine line between bringing out facts that are important for the voters to know about somebody's claims. Those are certainly fair game for debate, versus having something feel or seem like it's a personal attack on an individual. And, you know, having been a nurse and taking care of people for most of my career, my philosophy has been to keep it to the facts, fight a tough battle. It's okay to compare information. Stacy certainly brought up issues that, you know, she thought were important in our debates about me, and we had an opportunity to have some healthy debate about it. Stacy's a very bright lady, articulate, obviously was very successful in her career. And, you know, so she brought certain strengths, including a pretty large war chest, and that was just really a tough thing for me when I had, you know, teachers, nurses, and child care workers writing me checks.
Well, let's talk about the future. In July, we learned that the State Parks Department had us about $55 million in some special accounts. At the same time, there's thoughts of closing some of the parks to save about $22 million. Marin Supervisors recently approved a ballot measure for November to increase the sales tax to generate money for parks. Talk a little bit about that, and what are your thoughts about the wisdom of going forward with that?
Well, we had a poll that showed that 2/3 of the people in Marin County would be willing to support an initiative like this. And the money is only going to our local county parks. It's also going to city parks and helping with wildland-urban fire interface issues. It's also 20% of it is going to go to help our small family farmers protect our heritage in agriculture and the open spaces that we have there. And that money can't be taken by the state. It's hugely unfortunate that none of our legislators or the bureaucrats in Sacramento were able to identify that $54 million before the decision was made to close state parks and send everybody tumbling. That amount of money would have given us an opportunity to have a little bit longer glide path to figure out how we restructure and reshape how we manage our state parks. Our parks, whether they're state or county, are our public backyard. It's a level playing field. Everybody gets a chance to enjoy them. They're beautiful, and we have, I think, an obligation to maintain them. But it's also expensive to do that. And so we're going to ask the voters in November if they want to support it. We'll see what happens.
All right, we'll look for that on the ballot in November.
Thank you.
Susan, thank you for joining us and sharing your story from the campaign trail.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here again.
Since 1852, there has been a prison at Point San Quentin. Today, the state prison is Marin County's second largest employer, with a staff of 2,058. The inmate population fluctuates at around 5,000, and there are 1,500 lifers. Those are the people who are serving 7 to life or 15 to life, so on. Their hopes to be released rest with the Board of Parole hearings, which review each lifer's record, their behavior in prison, their participation in self-help programs, and make a determination whether or not they're suitable for release. Nancy Mullane is an independent reporter and producer for public radio programs. She's written a new book, Life After Murder, which profiles 5 lifers who were held at San Quentin and their road to freedom. Nancy, welcome to Marin Voices and Views.
Well, thank you for having me.
Nancy, almost everyone in Marin sees San Quentin on a daily basis as we ride by, but none of us really know what goes on behind the gates. Can you tell us your view of the prison and what attracted you to the stories that you want to tell in your book?
Well, I'm a reporter, and I was asked to do a story about the California prison system. There's 32 prisons. At the time, there was about 170,000 inmates serving time in these institutions, and I wanted to go inside one institution, and San Quentin is close. I live in San Francisco and work in San Francisco, so I thought I'll go to the closest one, and it was San Quentin. I was like you. I've traveled by the prison, looked over as I'm going on my journeys, and I've seen those walls and those slits of windows, and I thought, I wonder what's going on behind that. And I had the opportunity to go inside as a reporter. And the first time I went in, it was scary, because there's 5,000 inmates inside the prison. I'd never been in a prison before. And I spoke to the warden. But after talking to the warden, the public information officer, Lieutenant Eric Messick, took me through the Sally Port, which is kind of a locked environment so that they can control who goes in and out of the area of the prison where the prisoners are. And after we passed through the Sally Port, the public information officer's cell phone went off, and he said, I have to take care of this. I'm going to put you in this little room by yourself to wait for me. And I was a little concerned, but I thought he must have locked the door, because this is where prisoners are walking around with guards with guns. But I felt I must be safe. The problem was he didn't lock the door, and a few moments later, the door did open, and 4 men who were serving life sentences for murder were standing in the doorway. They walked in, sat down with me, and began having a conversation. And my impressions of people who have committed murder was that they are so dangerous that we have to keep them behind these walls, because if they ever get out, they'll want to kill again. And so that was my impression. Once a murderer, always a murderer.
So you had the rabid dog perception? I
had the monster in my mind. And these men didn't look like a monster or monsters, but they looked pale. They were all middle-aged, between the age of 30 and maybe 45, 50. But they sat down in the room with me and began having a conversation about a test. But I thought it was just a ruse, that they were really talking about, you get the shiv and you grab her and I'll hold her down. And I thought it was all over. But a few minutes later, the door opened again, and 2 more men who were lifers, men serving life sentences for murder, walked in the room, sat down. Now there's 6 of them and 1 of me. And I was quite sure that was the end. A few minutes passed, and one of them looked at me and said, who are you and what are you doing here? And he reached out his hand and said, I'm Don Kronk. And that was, it was just this, all of my fears were still there, but they didn't look like men who wanted to kill me.
And Don Kronk is one of the lifers who's been released, who you write about in the book. You profile his case and the ups and downs of his effort to win parole. Mm-hmm. And the process has become increasingly politicized over the last 25 years. And our political leaders have attempted to balance the rights of inmates with the demand for public safety. And that is influenced by tabloid media coverage of certain cases: Charlie Manson, Archie Fain, Richard Allen Davis, Scott Peterson. And the elected officials are afraid of the wrath of voters. Governor Davis really reached a low point where he essentially averaged 1 parole per year while he was governor. Is the system fair to life prisoners?
Well, you have to start back at the beginning. And this, prior to 1988, if a person serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole for a murder conviction in the state of California went before the parole board, and after they had served their sentence of 15 to life for second degree, 25 to life for first degree, they went before the parole board, commonly denied. If they were found suitable, they were released from prison within days. But in 1988, the voters passed an initiative, and that was the year of Willie Horton, when Governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, was running for president. And under his governorship in Massachusetts, a man named Willie Horton, who had been serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, was released on a weekend furlough program under a bill that was passed by the Massachusetts legislature. He fled Massachusetts, didn't come back at the end of the weekend, went to Maryland, where he raped a woman and brutally beat her boyfriend. That was a person, Willie Horton was serving life without the possibility of parole. Now, in 1988, the voters of California saw that situation and said, let's hold our governor accountable. Let's make it so that after a person serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole in California has gone before the parole board, has had an hours and hours long parole hearing and found suitable, let's give the governor 150 days to determine whether or not to release that person or reverse that parole. At the time in California, between 100 and 400 lifers were getting out every year with the lowest recidivism rate of any category of crime. In fact, they were the most safe to let out. After 1988, and for the last 24 years now, governors in this state have reversed between 75 and 99% of all lifers found suitable by the parole board, which is appointed by the governor. They've been reversed. So we've gone from around 6,000 lifers in the state of California to 30,000 lifers.
So it sounds like it's harder to get out. The sentences are longer for the lifers. And one of the things in your book, Life After Murder, that struck me is that each of the 5 fellows that you talk about, one of the common threads was the reason they're there was like a bad decision. Like
Bad decision.
An instantaneous bad decision that led to that. Is that something that you've seen when you're talking with the lifers?
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about this last 5 years. That as a reporter, when I began working in 2007, I had no idea that first meeting with Don Kronk was going to result in a 5-year quest for the answer, because everywhere I turned, trying to find out, who do people who commit murder become? And it was very hard to get that answer. But what I found was that I began one interview after another, and one story after another. And what I did find is exactly what you've just described, is murders are, we think when we hear the word murder that we see this vicious, aggressive, planned act, when in fact the vast majority of murders that take place they're not planned. It's a bad decision that turns into a worse decision that turns into a horrendous act. And once it happens, in the seconds that it happens, it's over. And there's so much remorse and grief and guilt. But at that point, there's nothing that can be done to give that person's life back. There was a group meeting the other night with a restorative justice organization, and they had a room full. It actually was a man came who goes inside San Quentin and meets with lifers. And they had a room of probably 20 lifers inside San Quentin. And they asked them all to add up the number of years they had done on their crimes. And it was 552 years on these men's crimes. And then they said, let's count up how long it was from the moment of imminent danger when you realized something could happen till the moment when the crime actually occurred, when the murder occurred. And all of their crimes took place, when they added up them all, in 12 hours. So we've got 12 hours of crime, and we've got 552 years of serving time in prison. And many of these men will probably never get out of prison, even though they're given a life with the possibility of parole. So it is, and one of the hope of this book is that this will be read by teenagers, young people who can read it and see in 5 murders how that murder took place, how these different circumstances can happen, and how one very bad decision at the beginning can turn into a horrific act.
Nancy, your book chronicles the cases of these 5 men, and under Governor Schwarzenegger, things got a little bit better. And currently under Governor Brown, he's only reversing something less than 20% of the paroles approved by the parole board. Is that correct?
That's correct. Governor Schwarzenegger, if you look back at, as you mentioned before, when you look back at first Wilson, it was about 131 total, released in 8 years. And then Davis, he allowed, of all the parole board suitability findings, 8 and 6 years. And then you look at Schwarzenegger. When Governor Schwarzenegger came in, his first year, he allowed 72 parole board suitabilities to stand. And everyone was looking at that thinking there's been a huge shift in the governor's role. But then, over the years that Schwarzenegger was in, it began to fluctuate. 72, 40, 20, got down to about 24. Then it went up. And in the last year, he allowed a huge number to leave. I believe it was over 200. Then Governor Brown came in, and by now, in 23 years, we now have 10,000 lifers who have all served their minimal eligible parole date. They've served their time, and they're eligible for parole, but they can't get out because of this very conservative parole board, which is, we want a good parole board, but after they're found suitable, the difficulty of getting a governor to let them out. Governor Brown has come in, and since he came into office, he is reversing only 17%. He's allowing 83% of those individuals who have been found suitable for parole to go home. And
so far, no Willie Hortons on his watch.
Not one.
Nancy Mullane, thank you for joining us. There's much more in the book, and I want to recommend that people go to your website, lifeaftermurder.org, because the radio reports that you filed for NPR's Weekend Edition are there for people to listen to. I think they're very interesting and very powerful, and I hope they will check them out. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.